So here's where things start getting very interesting, and honestly a little unsettling, because Sean Diddy Combs could be getting out of prison much earlier than anyone expected. And the way this is unfolding raises serious questions about how this entire case has been handled from the very beginning. Now, yes, it's true that his time behind bars was extended by about a month due to reported misconduct while incarcerated, and that detail alone already told us a lot about his mindset and behavior. But what most people missed is that shortly after that extension, his release date was quietly moved forward again, by about a week, which signals that whatever disciplinary issue occurred was either resolved, reassessed, or deemed not as severe as initially portrayed. And when you're talking about the federal system, dates do not just move around casually, especially for a high-profile inmate like this. So the fact that his time was first extended and then partially rolled back tells me there is far more happening behind the scenes than what the public is being told. No official explanation was given, no clear justification was offered, and that silence alone creates room for speculation, concern, and scrutiny, particularly when prosecutors are simultaneously out here projecting confidence and saying, with a very aggressive tone, that this man is not getting out anytime soon. That contrast is important, because on one hand you have the state trying to project control and finality, and on the other hand you have Diddy's legal team slowly laying the groundwork for something much bigger. An appeal strategy that isn't just about shaving time off a sentence, but about challenging the very fairness of how this conviction was structured. Attorney Mark Geragos has now stepped forward with an official statement, and his words are not accidental, emotional, or reckless. They are deliberate, strategic, and pointed directly at the heart of the prosecution's conduct. He made it clear that while Diddy was convicted on 2 Mann Act violations, he was acquitted of the most severe charges, the ones that would have carried a mandatory life sentence and resulted in the forfeiture of his entire fortune. And that matters because in Geragos' view, and frankly in the view of many legal scholars, you cannot punish a man more harshly based on conduct a jury explicitly rejected. When Geragos says Diddy rolled the dice and won, he's not celebrating, he's making a legal argument that the prosecution overreached, overcharged, and then attempted to claw back punishment through sentencing enhancements tied to accusations that did not survive trial. For an older audience especially, this should sound alarm bells, because regardless of how you feel about Diddy personally, the principle here affects everyone. If the government can enhance punishment using allegations that failed in court, then acquittals become meaningless. Geragos went even further, saying that not only was this fundamentally unfair, but that the prosecution itself should be penalized for overcharging in the first place, and that in a just system, Diddy should have been released immediately. That is an extraordinary statement to make publicly, and lawyers do not speak like that unless they believe they have real leverage. What's also notable, and frankly suspicious to many watching closely, is the absence of Mark Agnifilo, the attorney who had been the most visible face of Diddy's defense earlier on, especially during that controversial documentary moment where he was recorded without consent. Since then, Agnifilo has been conspicuously silent, while statements about lawsuits, appeals, and public positioning have come either from a PR spokesperson most people had never heard of before, or from secondary attorneys like Alexandra Shapiro and now Mark Geragos, which suggests internal strategy shifts, possible frustration, or simply a reallocation of roles now that the main criminal trial has concluded. Whether Agnifilo stepped back due to personal reasons, professional overload, or fallout from that recording incident, the reality is that the legal voices speaking now are the ones preparing the appeal. And appeals are not about emotion, they are about procedure, fairness, and precedent. And this is where the story moves from gossip into something much more consequential, because what Diddy's lawyers are signaling is that the appeal is not a long-shot Hail Mary. It is a calculated attack on how this case was charged, tried, and sentenced, with the ultimate goal of immediate release, or, at the very least, a dramatically reduced outcome. This appeal is expected to move quickly, potentially as early as April or May, because Diddy's team is pushing to expedite, arguing that he should not be sitting in prison at all under these circumstances, and that urgency alone tells you they believe the law is on their side, or at least vulnerable enough to exploit. And as uncomfortable as this may be for some to hear, especially given the emotional weight surrounding this case, the justice system is not supposed to be about feelings or reputations. It is supposed to be about rules, and when those rules are bent, stretched, or ignored, even deeply unpopular defendants can find doors opening that once seemed sealed shut. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a second, quieter, but potentially more powerful legal battle that could reshape how this entire case is remembered. And this is where the situation grows even more serious, because what Diddy's legal team is doing now goes far beyond arguing about dates on a calendar or a few months shaved off a sentence. They are actively laying the foundation for an appeal that challenges the integrity of the prosecution itself, and that is not something defense attorneys do lightly. When lawyers begin talking about penalizing prosecutors, they are essentially saying, "You didn't just make a mistake, you abused your power," and that accusation carries weight, especially in a system that depends on public trust. The appeal that is coming is not a retrial in the traditional sense, but it is still a courtroom battle where judges will re-examine how evidence was used, how charges were stacked, and whether sentencing enhancements were legally appropriate. And Diddy's team is signaling that they believe the government crossed a line by punishing him for conduct a jury explicitly rejected. That argument, if successful, does not just benefit Diddy. It sets a precedent that affects countless future defendants, which is exactly why this case is drawing attention from outside legal organizations who normally would not involve themselves in a celebrity matter. The National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers has now submitted a formal filing, not to defend Diddy personally, but to warn the court that the legal reasoning used here could open the door to dangerous overreach in other cases. And when a national organization steps in like that, it's because they see something that makes them uneasy, something that could ripple outward far beyond one man in one cell. Their message to the judge is essentially this: be careful, because the way you handle this appeal will echo through future prosecutions, affecting ordinary people who do not have high-powered attorneys or public platforms. For an older audience especially, this should feel familiar, because many of you have lived long enough to see how quickly legal standards can shift when courts allow shortcuts in the name of punishment. This filing alone strengthens Diddy's position, because it reframes the appeal as a matter of constitutional fairness rather than celebrity privilege. And judges are far more receptive to arguments about systemic consequences than they are to personal pleas. At the same time, prosecutors are attempting to maintain an image of certainty and control, publicly insisting that Diddy will remain behind bars and that any talk of early release is wishful thinking. But that confidence often masks internal pressure, because appeals are unpredictable, and once questions of fairness enter the record, outcomes become less secure. What makes this moment especially tense is that Diddy's team is not just asking for a reduced sentence or a technical correction. They are arguing that he should be released immediately while the appeal is pending, which would be a stunning development given the scale and publicity of the case. That request alone tells us they believe they have identified a legal vulnerability strong enough to justify emergency consideration, and courts do not entertain those requests unless the arguments are at least plausible. However, looming over all of this is a darker possibility that could completely change the game: a new criminal indictment. There are still individuals and entities reportedly pushing for additional charges, and if prosecutors manage to bring fresh criminal counts, it could neutralize the appeal strategy overnight and lock Diddy into a much longer legal battle. That looming threat is why this moment feels so unstable. Everything hinges on timing, decisions made behind closed doors, and whether the state believes it has enough left to escalate further. For now, though, the reality is this: Diddy's legal situation is far from settled, and despite the confident tone coming from prosecutors, there are enough cracks in this case to give his defense real leverage. Whether you believe he deserves that leverage or not is a personal judgment, but the law does not operate on emotions, it operates on standards, and when those standards are questioned, even the most powerful cases can begin to unravel. This appeal will not just determine how long Diddy remains incarcerated, it will determine how aggressively prosecutors are allowed to charge defendants in the future, and that is why so many legal eyes are quietly watching what happens next. Now shifting gears, because while the Diddy appeal is unfolding in courtrooms and legal filings, there's another story playing out in public that speaks just as loudly about accountability, responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked behavior. And that's what's happening with Stefon Diggs, a man whose name was barely mentioned in the public conversation until his relationship with Cardi B put him under a much brighter spotlight. And almost immediately, that spotlight exposed a series of troubling developments that should concern anyone who believes success comes with responsibility. Stefon Diggs is now facing yet another paternity lawsuit, this time filed by an influencer named Aylin Lira, who claims she has irrefutable evidence and is formally requesting DNA testing along with full parental support, and while he has not responded publicly, the silence speaks volumes. This is not the first time his name has appeared in court documents tied to paternity, And when patterns begin to repeat themselves, they stop looking like coincidences and start looking like character issues. What makes this situation even more alarming is the timing. This lawsuit follows on the heels of extremely serious legal trouble, including recent charges involving strangulation and multiple other misdemeanors, all surfacing as the year came to a close. For an older audience, this feels painfully familiar. A talented man at the height of his earning power, making reckless choices that jeopardize everything he has built. The frustration here is not moral judgment, it's common sense. Stefon Diggs has wealth, access, resources, and advisors, yet he continues to place himself in situations that lead to lawsuits, allegations, and potential financial devastation, and when children are involved, the stakes become even higher. Child support obligations do not disappear, careers do not last forever, and public tolerance for repeated misconduct wears thin very quickly. What's especially disturbing is how casually some men treat these consequences, as if their income will always be there, as if the league will always protect them, and as if public sympathy is infinite, but history tells us otherwise. We have seen countless athletes lose everything within a decade of retirement, not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked discipline, foresight, and accountability. And that's why this situation has people drawing uncomfortable comparisons to Diddy, because when accusations begin piling up, from women, from courts, from law enforcement, it signals a deeper problem, one that cannot be solved by silence or money alone. The advice here is simple but urgent. Fix your life before the system fixes it for you. Protect your future, protect your finances, and most importantly, protect the innocent people, especially children, who get pulled into these situations without choice. Fame does not insulate anyone from consequences, and the older you get, the harder those consequences hit. Stefon Diggs is still young enough to course correct, but only if he takes responsibility now, because the road he's on ends the same way it always does. Legal debt, public shame, and a legacy defined not by success on the field, but by chaos off it. And finally, we arrive at the situation that almost feels like the exclamation point on everything we've talked about today, because the ongoing tension between 50 Cent and Dame Dash is not just internet drama. It's a cautionary tale about pride, priorities, and the long-term consequences of how men choose to live their lives. Dame Dash, once celebrated as a visionary and mogul, is now facing severe financial distress, so much so that he attempted to auction off his film studios in an effort to ease mounting debt, only for them to sell for a staggering and humiliating $100, a number so low it borders on symbolic rather than transactional. And while that moment alone speaks volumes, what truly deepens the tragedy is Dame's continued focus on attacking others, particularly 50 Cent, rather than confronting the reality of his own circumstances. 50 Cent, meanwhile, represents the opposite trajectory. Disciplined, focused, and strategic, with thriving television franchises, sold-out appearances, and a career that has evolved rather than collapsed. While Jay-Z faces financial lawsuits, Diddy sits in prison navigating appeals, and Dame Dash struggles to stay afloat. 50 Cent has positioned himself as the last man standing from an era that claimed many giants, and that contrast is impossible to ignore. For an older audience, this story feels deeply familiar because it mirrors what we've seen time and time again. Men who let ego override planning, resentment replace accountability, and short-term gratification sabotage long-term security. The instinct to lash out, to cuss out another man while your own house is on fire, is not strength. It is distraction, and distraction is often the final step before collapse. What ties all of these stories together, Diddy, Stefon Diggs, Dame Dash, is not fame or money, but a failure to prioritize wisely when it mattered most. These are men who had access, opportunity, and influence, yet repeatedly made choices that invited chaos into their lives, and now that chaos is demanding payment in the form of lawsuits, prison time, and public humiliation. And the lesson here is not about mockery or superiority. It is about awareness. Success is temporary, youth is fleeting, and public favor is fragile, but character, discipline, and foresight are what determine how a life ultimately unfolds. As we step into a new year, these stories serve as reminders, not just for celebrities but for everyone watching, that no amount of wealth can outpace accountability forever. The choices made in private eventually surface in public, and when they do, they define legacies more than awards, titles, or applause ever could. So as we watch these cases continue to develop, especially with Diddy's appeal looming, the real question isn't who will win or lose. It's who will finally learn, and who will repeat the same mistakes until there's nothing left to lose.